Welcome to Secret Story. The sun beat down on yet another glorious day of heat in the sprawling, sparkling, dream-filled metropolis of Shorehaven. The summer's heat rose from the warm ground in shimmering air as the city went about its business. Whether it was people heading to the beach for the glorious sunshine, heading to work for whichever job they were employed in, or simply doing one of the countless other activities people do that fill their lives, sunshine always lifted people's moods, and within the city of taboo dreams things were no different. Within the area of the city known as Havendale, an area filled with lovely-looking homes, gardens, and people, Zoe Weber lay in the back garden of the house she shared with her fiancé, Kevin McCrea, enjoying the heat of the sun in its clear blue sky as she lay sunbathing peacefully. Her long, slightly wavy, blonde hair lay spread about her beautiful face as she lay on the lounge chair soaking up the rays. Her large, emerald-colored eyes were hidden behind the dark sunglasses she wore. Slim waist, smooth legs, and simply gorgeous body, was wrapped only under the average-sized blue that revealed her body to perfection. It still hid enough to entice the imagination as to what treasures lay beneath though. Zoe had been lying in the heat for some time now, enjoying the warmth as it shone down on her while the soft, gentle breeze stirred occasionally. It was another beautiful day in the sparkling city. And one Zoe intended to take full advantage of. She and Kevin had been engaged for 1.5 years now and had been together for 2 years before that. The wedding they had planned would be in a couple of months, and so most of their time was taken up either working or organizing wedding things. Everything was going as planned, however. But today Zoe intended to just take a day off and enjoy the glorious weather. Kevin, her loving, and not to mention hot, fiancé had been spending time with her out in the sun earlier, until the phone rang and he had gone out to meet up with his best friend, Will. Zoe thought that Kevin might ask Will to be his best man soon. She wished he would hurry up with that. It would make planning a lot simpler. The two had been gone. Well, Zoe wasn't sure how long, as she had fallen asleep in the sun for a little while. But when she had woken up, Kevin and Will had been inside. They were no doubt having a drink and talking about some guy's stuff or something like that. Maybe watching a film or something. Kevin had popped out long enough to tell her that he was back, and that Will was there, but since then he had left her to enjoy the sunshine. That she didn't mind at all. It was nice to enjoy the sun on her own in the garden. There was something peaceful about it all. Sighing happily, Zoe shifted on the lounge chair and took a sip of her drink that she had on the table beside her. Then she looked down at her gorgeous, sun-drenched body. She had been out in the sun a while and had planned on taking her off to make sure she didn't get any tan lines. However, now that Will was there, that had to be changed. Sitting up reluctantly and swinging her legs off the lounger, Zoe decided that she should probably leave the sunbathing for today or she would have tan lines. So, she picked up her drink as she stood up and finished it off. Then she headed towards the house, deciding that a nice shower would be just the perfect end to a nice peaceful day of lounging. After that she would join the guys in whatever it was they had decided on doing, leaving the glass on the counter in the kitchen. Zoe made her way into the lounge. She smiled prettily to herself in happiness. "Going that way, you're totally going to need it," Will was jesting as Zoe walked through the doors from the kitchen. The moment she entered the room the conversation cut off just as sudden as when a stereo is unplugged halfway through a song, and both men turned to look at her. Zoe had known the reaction she would get before she had even entered the house, especially because she was only dressed in her. It was not as revealing as some she owned, and it showed her flat stomach, slim waist, and smooth legs off completely. However, even if she hadn't been wearing that, Zoe still would have known how both men would react to her 23-year-old body. Kevin looked towards her with love and pride as she came in, while Will stared at her in appreciation, with a hint of hunger in his eyes. Zoe's smile widened as she looked at the two behind her dark sunglasses. The two of them always reacted the same. Will had always had a thing for her and was always making comments on how hot she looked or letting his eyes ogle various parts of her whenever he came over. Kevin didn't care at all at his friend's reaction and knew Will had a thing for her, but it had never bothered him. When Zoe had first asked him about it, he had said that he knew she was beautiful and that guys would always enjoy looking at her. That couldn't be helped, he had said. And he didn't mind people looking as he knew that she was his and that she loved him and him alone. Which she did with all of her heart. That it was true. guys had always looked at her with the same stare Will always had when she was around, and it was nice that Kevin was so relaxed about it all. His confidence was something Zoe had always loved about him. It helped her feel that she could be herself without him worrying about her being unfaithful to him. She had never minded other women looking at him, so it was nice to have that returned. Some of her boyfriends in the past hadn't been so laid back. So, when she found Kevin, it had been like a huge weight had been taken from her shoulders. Not that she never really flirted with other guys. Occasionally she would reply to a comment Will would make teasingly or jokingly, but she never really flirted with anyone other than Kevin. But it was nice that he did not worry so much. Seeing the looks of focus on their faces as she came through the doors, Zoe laughed inside to herself as she thought for perhaps the millionth time how simple it was to distract a man from his concentration. "Don't let me interrupt, boys, I'm just passing through," Zoe said amusedly, causing both to smile deeper. Kevin, out of amusement, and Will no doubt out of a deeper appreciation for her body. "Had enough of the sun, Zoe?" Kevin asked her as he leaned back in his chair. "For today," she replied with a smile, "I'll work on my tan lines tomorrow." Before she had said it, she had known exactly what Will would say. It was obvious why she would work on them tomorrow and not right then. And sure enough, she was proven correct. "No need for you to stop on my account, Zoe," Will remarked right on cue, to which Kevin shook his head as he smiled amusedly. "You never give up, do you, man?" Zoe's loving fiancé said with amusement, and Will simply shrugged with a grin as he leaned back. "Just a little light-hearted fun, you know that, Kev," Will replied. However, his not-so-hidden glance back at Zoe gave away the if not lie then certainly obvious lack of complete truth to that statement. Shaking her head as she smiled, Zoe made her way past the two, as they sat on the chairs opposite each other, and headed towards the lounge door. "I'm going to have a shower and get changed. Save me a cold one too." "I'll be down in about half an hour," Zoe said as she opened the door. "All right, babe, see you in a bit," Kevin replied lovingly. "Ah, that's a shame, I like what you're wearing," Will added, his eyes still watching her with that same appreciation. Rolling her eyes, Zoe shook her head as she smiled faintly at her fiancé's best friend. "How do you ever get so many girls with lines like that, Will?" she asked jestingly, although she had always wondered. Will was well known as being a ladies' man and getting a lot of girls. Usually for either one-night stands or simply casual sex. That he had never had a girlfriend in the whole time Zoe had known him, by his choice admittedly. He said that he liked being single, and the opportunities it afforded him to be with whoever he wanted. That he was good-looking, there was no doubt in that, but the lines he came out with to her were just terrible, or incredibly cheesy. How he managed to get any woman, let alone so many, was always a mystery to Zoe. "Oh, if the lines don't work, my secret weapon always does," Will answered with a broad grin and an amused laugh. The emphasis that he put on the word weapon was enough for anyone to tell what he was implying. Will's answer, however, made Zoe laugh, despite its implication. "Oh, that was so cheesy, only an airhead would fall for that," Zoe laughed amusedly, before leaning down to kiss Kevin on the head lightly and ruffle his hair lovingly. "You have a strange friend, baby." Both guys laughed at the jest, and Zoe smiled amusedly, before she straightened and turned to walk out of the room. "Have fun, boys. Remember to keep me a cold one," she added as she walked out of the room. Hearing both of the guys reply that they would, smiling to herself and feeling content, Zoe made her way upstairs and into the bathroom. She was going to look forward to this shower. She loved the feel of water running down her body. Zoe felt perfectly happy. The day simply couldn't get better. Kevin McCrea smiled to himself as he watched his 23-year-old girlfriend turn to walk up the stairs. Watching her always made him feel proud, either due to her indescribable beauty or because of one of the countless things that she did, big or small, that just made her the girl he wanted to marry. Turning back to his friend, Kevin took a swig from his beer as he laughed inside. Will was still staring at the door Zoe had gone through. Will had always had a thing for beautiful women. Well, for women in general. And he had always had a good way with them too. It was not very often that Will couldn't seduce a girl to give in to him, even those who weren't available. Kevin and his friends knew that Will had even managed to work his charm on women who no one would have thought would have been unfaithful, even the women themselves, those who resisted the good looks and charm, not to mention that secret weapon Will was always so proud about, were few and far between. However, Zoe was one of them. All of the guys were always careful having their girlfriends around Will. But Kevin had never really been worried about his friend being around Zoe. Zoe was strong-willed, and while she was very sexual, she was completely faithful. Oh, she would play around and joke of course, but Kevin had seen Will try his charm on Zoe, and she simply didn't respond to any of them. It was as if Will had said or done nothing at all. That thought made Kevin laugh inside again. It always got Will irritated when he couldn't succeed with women, and Zoe had never batted an eyelid at anything he did at all. Kevin smiled, half amusedly and half proudly. I bet she's one hell of a two, his friend jested, and Kevin laughed out loud this time. You ask me that every time you see her, Will. Kevin replied as he shook his head. His friend would never change. What do you think? He added rhetorically. Always makes me wonder why she's with you and not with the weapon, Will replied with a grin, as he indicated his crotch. Kevin took another drink of his beer, smiling amusedly at his friend. This was perhaps the 1000th time they had had this exact same conversation. Will really wouldn't change. Perhaps because she loves me, man. It isn't all about your weapon, Kevin replied, as he leaned back in his chair. Man, I bet that's not what Zoe would say if I gave her the secret weapon, Will answered back, eyeing the door and shaking his head as if he was still amazed at just how hot Zoe looked. No doubt he actually was at that. Kevin laughed again. If there was one thing he knew, it was that Zoe was completely satisfied with him. I doubt that, mate. She is a completely satisfied woman, he replied proudly. Will turned to regard him once more with that big grin of his. That's because I have never tried with her, man. You're my best friend, and she's your girl, he said in return confidently. While Kevin trusted Will as his best friend in most everything, he knew that if he ever had a chance with Zoe he would take it. Luckily there was no doubt in Kevin's mind that Zoe would never even entertain the thought of being unfaithful, let alone cheating on him. No matter what. Will, I've seen you try your moves on her. It was like water off a duck's back, Kevin replied amusedly, taking another swig from his bottle. His friend really was too overconfident. Not every woman he had tried to seduce had succumbed to his charms. Yeah, but that's because I wasn't trying hard. Man. As I said, she's your girl, and I wouldn't do that to my main man. But, if I did unleash the moves, Zoe would be begging for it like all the rest, Will said, nodding triumphantly as if he had already succeeded in screwing her. Unleash the moves. Kevin replied, and almost choked on his beer as he tried not to laugh out loud. Man, even if you had any more moves to try on her, I know she wouldn't go for it. She's not like the others you've aimed at. Will grinned deeper as he leaned forward to obviously emphasize what he was about to say. I have some more moves, ones I usually reserve for special cases that prove more difficult to hunt, his friend said, sounding completely confident. Despite the fact that Kevin knew there were women who he had tried everything to bed and they had still turned him down, I just haven't used them because you were there. Women are more resistant around their men. This time Kevin did laugh loudly. I thought the reason was because you're my best friend. Kevin replied amusedly. His friend's overconfidence despite the facts was hilarious. Yeah, but I meant if I was going to try, you know, Will answered as he leaned back, swigging his beer. Kevin watched his friend as he raised his own bottle to his lips. His friend truly wouldn't change his mind. He was adamant he could get Zoe under him, despite the fact that he had tried his charms on her before and received not even an irritated frown. It had been just simply as if he had done nothing. Kevin was so certain no matter what Will or anyone else tried, Zoe simply would never give in to them. That was just not her. Will. Man, you crack me up, Kevin replied, as he drank the last of his beer and placed the empty bottle on the table in front of him. No shitting, man. She'd be totally begging me for it, Will stated adamantly in reply. How the guy could be so seriously sure, Kevin would never know. There's no way you'd seduce her. I'm telling you, man. There's no way at all, he replied, as he grabbed the last bottle from this case. There were more in the refrigerator for later though. Will shook his head, his expression becoming more determined and competitive. Nah, man, I'm telling you, Kev. If I didn't hold back, Zoe would be riding this bad boy in an hour, tops. Your fiancé or not, his friend retorted, sounding as if he had no doubts. An hour? Now you are full of shit, Kevin replied, cracking open the beer and swigging from it calmly. He was as confident as Will appeared to be. I totally bet you I could. An hour, 2 at most, man, Will said in reply, before adding, but as I said, I wouldn't unleash the moves on your girl because you're my main man. Kevin sipped from his beer as he watched his friend for a moment. How he could be so confident when he was just so obviously wrong, Kevin could just not understand. There was obviously only one way to deal with this. Call his bluff and prove him wrong. Of course, he could just leave it, but then Will would take that as he was conceding he was right. And then he would believe he really could have Zoe if he wanted her, which Kevin knew was absolutely wrong. No, Will needed to be shown that he really couldn't have any woman he wanted, even if he should have learned from those he had failed to charm. Alright, I bet you couldn't, Kevin replied, and almost laughed again as Will was suddenly taken aback. What? You bet I couldn't what? Will said, blinking due to his shocked confusion. I bet you couldn't seduce Zoe if I left you to it for an hour or two, Kevin replied, sipping his beer calmly. You really bet that I couldn't get her to have with me? Are you serious? Because you know I totally could. Will replied, sounding less sure than he had moments earlier. Though he did try to seem as confident, Kevin nodded calmly. You think you can charm her? I know you couldn't. There seems no other way to solve it than a simple bet, he said calm and confident. Will watched him a moment, obviously trying to gauge whether he was being serious or not. Alright, Kev, what would the terms be? Will said carefully, definitely not as certain as he had been but too proud to back down. He had to know now that he had no chance. Well, if you win, you get to have with Zoe. If I win, you have to firstly admit to the guys that you really aren't such a ladies' man, that there are some women who don't want you. And second you give me 100, Kevin answered calmly. While he didn't want anyone but him having with Zoe, he knew that there was no way she would ever be charmed by Will in a whole lifetime, let alone in an hour or two. So, he knew he had already won. Will's eyes bulged at mention that he could have Zoe if he won. Though Kevin could still tell he was unsure that he could actually win, Kevin took another swig of his beer as he watched his friend debate in his head what to do. He obviously had doubts he could succeed now. So, he either lost face by losing the bet, or lost face by admitting he was wrong. His pride wouldn't let him do the latter, however. Alright, you're on, he said after a few moments. Before he stood up to offer Kevin his hand, Kevin couldn't help but smile a touch. Will really wouldn't change, even if he wasn't confident. He was still proud. Standing, Kevin took his friend's hand and shook it, sealing the bet. This was going to be the easiest bet he had ever won, he thought smugly. Will couldn't stop himself from feeling several emotions at once. Mostly, though, he felt a mix of shock, that Kevin would make such a bet, concern, because he knew why Kevin made that bet, and excitement, that he would get to try it on with Zoe. The only problem was, of course, as Kevin obviously knew all too well, Zoe had never given even the slightest hint that he was trying to charm her. No matter what he had done. And now because he had opened his big mouth, he had an hour or two to try to change that, or else he would have to lose face and money. How he was going to manage this, he had no idea. And it was obvious that Kevin was just as confident. Damn him for knowing him too well. Why had he been so proud and gotten himself into this mess? Despite thinking and feeling all of this at once, Will tried to keep his face calm and confident. He thought he managed a respectable job of it. Alright then, I'll head out now. You can tell Zoe that I went to get more beer or something, and I'll be back in a bit, Kevin said, as he placed the half-finished bottle on the table. An hour or two then? Will asked, hoping he didn't sound as if he was racking his brain on how to get out of this mess. Yep, something like that. I won't be less than an hour though. I have some things to pick up while I'm out anyway, his friend replied, and Will nodded. You have to be honest though. If you fail, you have to tell me, Kevin said, and then added with a touch of amused smugness, and if you win of course. His friend's smugness irked Will a little, even though he knew Kevin had good reason to be. Still, he couldn't lose face, so he replied. Oh, you'll hear her if I win when you come back. I'll make sure that we're upstairs in your bedroom, he chided amusedly, though inside he still racked his brain. Damn, why did he get himself into things he couldn't get out of? Kevin's amusement simply deepened as he nodded. Sure, his friend said smugly, I'll see you in an hour or two. Make sure you have my money. Will could do little more than nod, and he waited until Kevin had closed the door behind him before he sat down on the chair, staring at the sofa beside him, and cursed, as he leaned back a moment before he once more racked his brain. Think, Will, think. As Will tried vainly to rack his brain on how to seduce his friend's fiancée, and save face by winning this bet, Zoe stepped out of the shower and dried herself off. Then she headed into her and Kevin's bedroom to decide on something to wear. Completely unaware of the bet her fiancé and his best friend had just made downstairs, having looked through her wardrobe and dried her hair, Zoe Weber finally stood in front of the full-length mirror, buttoning up the sky blue, mid-thigh length skirt that she had picked out to match her white strappy vest top. The outfit was comfortable and made her look sexy, which she always liked to be for Kevin. I think you'll do, Miss Weber, Zoe said to herself, as she picked up her engagement ring and placed it on her finger. She couldn't wait for that to be joined by the wedding band. Not long now, she thought with a smile. Turning from the mirror, Zoe left the wet towels on the bed and floor, figuring that she would pick them up later and put them in the washing machine. For now, she wanted that nice cold drink and a good conversation with the guys. Heading downstairs, Zoe had a spring in her step and a feel of how good the day was already. Turning into the lounge, she smiled at Will, who was still sitting in the same chair he had been in when she left. Turning to where Kevin had last been, she was about to give him a smile too when she noticed he wasn't there. Kevin in the kitchen? Zoe asked, as she sat on the sofa and looked back to Will. Nah. He headed out to get some more beer and some other things. He said he'd be back in an hour or so, Will replied in an odd tone that made Zoe think he was a little nervous. That quickly passed however, and he was the same confident Will she had always known him to be. He said I should entertain you while he's away. Zoe looked to her fiancé's friend a little confusedly for a moment. She was sure there was another case of beer in the refrigerator. There's another case in the kitchen, I'm sure, Zoe said, and made to get up. However, Will spoke first. Yeah, Kev said there had been. But he had drank it over the last few days, Will replied, and gave her a smile that made her a little suspicious. Oh. Well, in that case we'll have to find something to talk about till he gets back, she said, as she sat back and crossed her legs, clearing her throat. Zoe looked at Will as if he hadn't been openly eyeing her up. The best way with Will was to ignore his behavior, unless he got too heavy, which he never usually did unless he thought the woman wanted him to. So, what shall we talk about? She asked him calmly. How about how good you look? Especially in those clothes, Zoe, her fiancé's friend answered. Then he whistled at her. Or we could talk about the weather. It's a nice day. Or how about how things are in your life? She replied calmly, folding her arms beneath her ample tits. Will smiled deeply, as he let his eyes roam over her once more. Nah, I prefer to talk about you. You're far more interesting, Will said in reply, as his eyes finally looked at her beautiful face. You're going to make the most beautiful bride. Zoe. Zoe couldn't help but smile inside at that one. It was always nice to be told you were beautiful. Though she didn't let Will know that, of course. Instead, she simply tried to change the subject subtly. The wedding isn't far off now. I can't wait, she said subtly. You'll look sexy in a wedding dress, Will replied. However, before Zoe could think she had finally succeeded in changing the subject, he added, I always wanted to see you dressed in white. There was no doubt what meaning her fiancé's friend meant behind those last words. Rolling her eyes at him, Zoe smiled and shook her head. You really aren't subtle, are you, Will? Next you'll be asking me if my dress is tight and low-cut. She said amusedly. Will's smile deepened as he took a deep swig of his beer and finished it off, placing it on the table next to the half-empty bottle that obviously belonged to Kevin. Is it? He asked enthusiastically. If it is, I have an excellent pearl necklace that would look good on you. I could give it to you at the wedding. Zoe once more rolled her eyes and stood up. How you get women I'll never know, Will, she chided good-naturedly. Will simply laughed lightly, as he asked her why she had stood up. I still want a drink. Even if you two did drink them all before I finished my shower, she answered. As she walked through to the kitchen, she ignored both Will's insinuating smile at her mentioning her shower, and the fact that he got up to follow her into the kitchen. She could feel his eyes on her ass as she walked. With Kevin not there, he was sure being bold. His friend's fiancée looked incredible. So incredible that Will just had to find a way to win this bet. He just had to. I can get a drink on my own, Will Harvey, Zoe chided teasingly, as she watched him follow her over her shoulder. Will gave her his best smile, as he walked over to the refrigerator. If she saw the case of beer still in there, she would know something was off. Time was ticking away, and he hadn't gotten even a playful smile from Zoe yet. I know. But I thought I'd help, he said, trying to sound noble as he opened the refrigerator and took out the only other thing except beer in there. Fruit juice. He made sure Zoe couldn't see as he opened the door. Besides, there's no one else for me to talk to here. So, you're talking to me as I'm the only one here? Thanks, Zoe replied with an amused smile, as she walked over to the counter. No, I'd still want to talk to you if you weren't. You're more interesting to talk to than Kevin. Not to mention a whole lot better looking, Will said in reply. As he turned to look at her once more, Zoe smiled in amusement at that. Before she turned to open a cupboard above the counter and reach up for a glass, Will wanted to simply stand there and stare at her gorgeous body as she reached up, stretching to reach for the glass. Zoe's smooth legs, her slim waist, her amazing tits, all on display to be stared at. But instead, Will decided to take the opportunity to push things a little further. Usually, if words seemed not to affect a woman he was pursuing, that a secret weapon usually swayed things in his favor. So, placing the juice on the counter, Will walked up right behind Zoe and reached over her to get the glass before she could get it. He pressed Zoe lightly against the counter, trapping her between it. Everything happened quickly. The moment he pressed against her, his hand picked up the glass, and Zoe turned to look at him over her shoulder. But before she could speak, Will spoke first. I thought I'd be a gentleman and help, he said, preempting her question. Then he moved away from her so that she could not say he had deliberately pressed himself against her. Though there was little doubt he had. As he had hoped, despite herself here was no way she couldn't have noticed that. Thanks, Zoe said, as she turned around to look at him. It was obvious that she wanted to say something else but couldn't find what to say. Good, if he had made her speechless then she was off balance. He knew he had been right, any time, Will replied, insinuating his real meaning. Zoe obviously understood as she flushed red a little and cleared her throat. Then she took the glass from him and turned to pour herself a glass of juice. As she took a deep drink, Will moved a little closer behind her and gently brushed her long, slightly wavy, blonde hair over one shoulder. You really do look beautiful, Zoe, he said in a softer tone, as he gently ran 2 fingers down the back of her neck, then down her spine. The touch made Zoe shiver and gave Will enough time to place one hand on her slim waist. Smiling slightly as she turned her head a little towards him, Zoe replied as she walked away from him, back towards the lounge. Thanks, was all she said, as she walked back into the lounge, sipping from her glass as if nothing had happened. As Will watched her, he could have cursed from frustration. What else could he do other than compliment her and try to arouse her interest? He had to think. Time was ticking away. You know. He said as he came through into the lounge and looked at Zoe as she sat cross-legged on the sofa. I feel like a dance, care to join me? Zoe smiled, seemingly very amused, as she gently shook her head and sipped her juice. I feel like sitting and talking, she replied sweetly, and Will gave her the best smile he could. Trying hard to hide his frustration, he sat down on the chair he had been in before, and so, for the next half an hour, the two of them sat and talked. With Will slipping in compliments on how gorgeous or amazing she was, or insinuating things about what he would like to do or how good he was at massages or other things. While Zoe talked away as if she noticed nothing he was doing. As time continued to pass away without any sign of progress, Will began to become more overt, trying desperately to do anything he could to try to charm her. That's why it's the best. Zoe finished whatever she had been saying. Will wasn't too sure as he had been racking his brain on what to do. He knew one thing though, to seduce anyone, you had to be close to them. And so, he made his next move. What's that? He asked as he frowned, looking at her hair. What? Zoe asked, as she turned to look at the hair she had left brushed over one shoulder, still looking as if he was looking at something in her hair. Will got up from his chair and moved to sit next to Zoe on the sofa. He pretended to grab something from her hair and dust it off onto the floor. Just a little fluff by the looks of it, he said, as he leaned on the back of the sofa and smiled faintly to her. Zoe didn't seem to notice that he was trying to get close to her this time and smiled back kindly. You know, Zoe, this top looks good on you. Haven't seen it before, Will commented, as he ran a finger up and down one of the shoulder straps. I have a lot of clothes. You probably haven't seen half of them, she replied calmly. Before sipping her juice, Will smiled. She hadn't stopped him, that was a good sign. Removing his finger, Will placed his arm on the back of the sofa, appearing to rest it there. Though it was positioned on the top of the cushions behind Zoe's head. You should show me some of them. Maybe give me a fashion show or something, he said in a more softer tone, as he let his hand slowly move closer to her. Then he started to gently stroke up and down her neck as he looked into her eyes. Zoe continued to smile, seemingly not noticing his touch. I'm sure you'd be bored watching me rummage through all of my clothes, she replied, as she stared back at him calmly. Bored of watching you? I don't think that's possible, Will said softly, as he ran his hand into her hair from behind. Man, you're beautiful. And you are overconfident, William Harvey, Zoe replied, as she pulled his hand away from her neck and back to him. I know you've charmed lots of women. Even those who weren't single. But it won't work on me. Will didn't know whether it was her friendly smile, the surety in her sweet voice, or the fact that time was running out and nothing he had done in the last 35 minutes had worked at all. Whatever it was, the frustration got to him. Ah, Kevin was right. He said irritably, as he turned to sit forward. He had tried everything he could think of in the time he had. And nothing. Nothing. Zoe eyed him curiously, a small smile on her face. Kevin was right about what? She asked him curiously. Ah, he was right that you would never be seduced by me. Man, I tried everything I could. He's going to be so smug with himself now, he answered in frustration. What else could he have done? He didn't have long, and he hadn't made any headway at all. Damn it. He'll be smug that you couldn't seduce me? Zoe asked, genuinely confused now, and not smiling playfully anymore as she looked at him in puzzlement. That Will was lost in his frustration, thinking of what he could have done. He answered without thinking. And the words he spoke were about to change more than he knew. Zoe watched Will as he stared forward in deep concentration, obviously frustrated that he hadn't been able to seduce her. Despite the fact it hadn't worked, Zoe did have to admit that he was skilled with his touch and words. So she could see why he ended up getting most of the women he went after. Especially when he had got the glass for her. The feel of it had sent an unintentional shiver down her spine. Well, she was only human after all. It would have again just from remembering it. However, right then all of that was out of her mind. What was Will going on about? Why on earth would Kevin be smug that his best friend couldn't seduce his fiancée? In fact, What had they been talking about it? And where was Kevin too? Confused thoughts flooded through Zoe's mind, and she was about to repeat her question when Will finally spoke. Ah. Looks like he won. Will said irritably, as he sat back obviously feeling defeated about something. What? What are you talking about? Who won what? Zoe asked. Feeling a little irritated herself from being so confused as to what Will was going on about. The bet we made. Will answered, and Zoe frowned feeling even more confused. Will, what bet? Tell me, will you, she said, sounding exactly as she felt. Well, she felt a little more exasperated than she sounded. Ah, I lost anyway, so it doesn't matter anymore, he replied. However, as he noticed Zoe's expression he quickly added, I was joking around. You know, telling him how hot you were, and how I could. Will trailed off, obviously not wanting to say what was next. However, he decided otherwise as she eyed him dangerously. All right, I was saying how I could, you know, charm you into having with me. If I wanted to. But that I never had, or would, because you're his girl, and I respect you both too much for that. Zoe looked at Will with impatience. He obviously got the message as he stopped blabbering and spoke quicker. Kev said there was no way I could, that you weren't like that. I said I could, and he made a bet with me, saying he would give me an hour or two to see if I could. He said that if I lost I'd have to admit to the guys that I wasn't a ladies' man and give him 100, Will said quickly, trailing off at the end. Zoe stared at her fiancé's best friend for a moment, feeling too stunned to say anything. Kevin had bet that his best friend couldn't seduce his fiancée. He had gone out to let his best friend try his charm on her. She was his fiancée. Suddenly, a thought hit her. Will had mentioned what Kevin won if he lost the bet. Welcome to Secret Story. What would you have won in this bet with Kevin? She asked in a voice that was already beginning to burn with anger. Will couldn't have missed the emotion in her voice or in her eyes, so he wisely spoke up, if a little warily. If I won in seducing you, I got to have with you, he said, and Zoe's anger exploded. What? She screamed loudly, it wasn't my idea, Zoe. Will began, but Zoe wasn't listening. How could Kevin, her fiancé, who she was meant to be marrying in a few months, bet her to his friend? And not just betting a kiss or something, but actually her. Honestly, Zoe, he just knew I wouldn't be able to. Because he trusts you, you know. Will said beside her, trying to calm her down. That doesn't make it right, Will. He still bet you couldn't bed me. She replied angrily, placing her glass on the table before she threw it at the wall. He didn't mean anything by it. He just wanted to shut me up, no doubt, Will said, once again trying to defend Kevin. He bet his best friend couldn't seduce his fiancée. And if you managed, that you could me? I'm his fiancée. Where the does he get the balls to bet me to another guy? She replied furiously. Will shrugged and kept quiet for a moment, before he worked up the courage to speak again. Sorry, Zoe. Honestly, there was no way. He began, but Zoe shook her head, a little of the heat leaving her. A little. No, I'd expect it from. And besides, I'm not your fiancé, she said sooth. Will nodded slightly, obviously glad he was off the hook. It was true though. Will she expected something like this from? But Kevin, he should have known better. I can't believe he'd make a bet like that. And even add that I was the prize. Zoe said as she sat back, the initial rage calming to a slightly quieter, more focused anger. Hey, I'm sure he wouldn't have meant his end, you know. Will said, once more trying to defend Zoe's absent asshole of a fiancé. It would have served him right if you had one. Let the walk in and see what he gets for making such an idiot bet. She replied acidly. It would have served the bastard right too. Maybe seeing his best friend screwing his fiancée would. Was she pissed off right now? Both of them sat there in silence for a while as Zoe thought over the fact that the man she was going to marry in a few months had bet his friend couldn't seduce her. Also, that if his friend had one that he could her. And, moreover, had even gone out to leave him to it for however long it was, he had left her to be subjected to whatever Will wanted to do to try to seduce her. Was that what she meant to him? All of Will's behavior since she had come downstairs made sense now. It all made sense, and she had ignored all of it like usual because she was faithful and good. Some of that attention had felt good too. But she would never have let Will go too far. And now she finds out that all of that time, Will had had Kevin's consent in being able to try to seduce her. What made it worse, even if Kevin had won, he would have got what? An admission from Will that everyone knows anyway, and 100. For what? It really would have served the right if Will had succeeded. All of the thoughts wound Zoe up even more. However, right then the one she wanted to unleash it all out on was still out. How long has he been out? Zoe asked irritably. About 45 minutes, Will replied, still unsure about whether to speak or not. 45 minutes. Will had said an hour or two. So, Kevin could be back in 15 minutes or any time after that. The anger within Zoe burned hotly. She needed to unleash it, or she was going to smash things. That didn't sound like a bad idea, but why should she take it out on things she would need to replace because of that? Suddenly, within her irate state, a thought came to Zoe that usually wouldn't have, but right then, it was most appealing, and it would serve that bastard right. All right then, Zoe said, as she stood up and turned around, planting her hands on her slim waist as she looked down at Will. He looked worried she was about to yell at him. After all, here's what I'm going to do. Will sat perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable tirade. Seeing as my loving fiancé obviously didn't care if his best friend me. I'm going to give you a, she said in a perfectly calm-sounding voice. Will's eyes shot wide open in surprise, which would have made Zoe laugh if she wasn't feeling so angry. What, seriously? He asked, as he stared at her incredulously. Zoe nodded. It would serve Kevin right. Bet her would he? Yep. Perfectly serious, she answered calmly. You may have lost your little bet, but obviously Kevin doesn't care if he bet me to you. So it will serve him right for being. Will stared at her a moment longer to see if she was actually serious. When he realized that she was, all concern left him as a big grin split his face and his eyes lit up as he quickly began to unbutton his jeans. One condition though. You can't tell Kevin, Zoe added calmly. What? That wasn't part of the bet. Besides, how is it getting back at Kevin if he doesn't know? Will asked incredulously, as he stopped unbuttoning his jeans halfway. Firstly, you didn't win that insulting bet. And secondly, because it will serve Kevin right to think that he won his stupid bet while you know that, Zoe answered. Besides, you either have to fulfill your end of that bet or fulfill it and have your by the girl your best friend is going to marry in a few months. A girl you know no one could get. Will obviously saw the logic in that. However, he was too proud, or stupid, to leave it at that. Alright, one more condition though. You can't spit, he replied, to which Zoe rolled her eyes. Obviously Will knew that she wanted to get back at Kevin enough to concede to something not too big. But something like this, besides, Kevin deserved it, the asshole. Fine, Zoe replied after a moment, and moved to stand before him. As Zoe stood in front of Will, her fiancé's best friend's eyes lit up once more. Zoe however simply only thought of this as getting back at Kevin. While Will was cute no doubt, and if she had been single, she may have gone for him, this was all about getting back at her idiot of a fiancé. The smile she gave Will had no mirth in it whatsoever. However, Will did not care as he watched his friend's fiancée slowly sink to her knees as Zoe reached for where Will had left his buttons half open. She watched her engagement ring glinting in the sunlight. Instead of making her think twice because she was engaged, the sight of the ring as she reached to unbutton the jeans of her fiancé's best friend made Zoe more angry at Kevin for being an asshole. And more determined to get back at him. This time, the smile she gave Will was full and playful. Kevin McCrea picked up the spade in the hardware store, looking it over carefully. He had intended on digging a small pond in the back garden at some point, having a new spade might help with that. Placing it in the trolley he had just picked out, he began to walk up the first aisle of the store, glancing at his watch as he made his way slowly. 45 minutes he had been gone now. He had decided not to head back straight away on the hour. He had no worries about Will winning this bet, so the guy could do with a little extra time, or he might complain that he hadn't had enough to try to charm Zoe properly. Man, this was going to be the easiest 100 that Kevin had ever made. Chuckling to himself, he continued to make his way up the aisle, thinking of the other few errands he had in mind to run while he fulfilled his part of the bet. Meanwhile, Kevin's best friend had accidentally told his loving fiancée all about the bet they had made. And now, as he pushed the cart around the corner and began heading slowly down the second aisle, his gorgeous bride-to-be was sinking to her knees. Kevin continued on, oblivious to what his bet had done, while Zoe pulled another button open. Will stared down at the top of Zoe's beautiful blonde head as she reached towards his jeans. He couldn't believe this was actually happening. And yet, now here she was, on her knees in front of him. He had thought things had all gone wrong. But they had turned out better than he figured, returning the playful smile that Zoe gave him when she looked up as she finished unbuttoning his jeans. As Will looked down into Zoe's eyes, she smiled playfully. This must have been like a dream come true for Will, having her on her knees in front of him. He was sure turned on enough to prove that. Obviously, the thought made Zoe feel a little proud. However, the anger at Kevin swallowed the feeling up almost instantly, and she turned her concentration back to the task at hand. Literally, Zoe looked up at him and smiled playfully. "Let's have a look at this secret weapon you keep telling me about," she said hotly. The moment Zoe's eyes fell back on Will, they widened in stunned shock. For a few moments all Zoe could do was stare at it, completely transfixed. "You like what you see, Zoe?" Will asked proudly. All she could do was nod slightly. She did. This thing was amazing. And now that she saw it, she understood why Will had said earlier that if his charm didn't work, his secret weapon would. Will was right. Here she was, engaged to the man she loved, about to be married in a few months. That realization should have made her feel guilty as hell. Instead, Zoe simply thought that Kevin deserved it for being the guy who would give her the wedding band to go with it in a few months. The image and thoughts were too much. Swiftly all thoughts of her fiancé, or of how angry she had been with him, which had led her to do this in the first place. How could any woman resist this? The feeling was amazing. He always loved to see wedding rings, engagement rings, and even eternity rings. When who was not exactly single? Kevin looked at his watch as he drove around the corner and pulled on to the car park. He had been out almost 55 minutes now, so he would start heading back soon. He had almost finished all of the errands he had decided to run, and so was ahead with all the planning for the week. He had also gotten Zoe a nice present, especially as he knew that Will would be reimbursing him with 100 anyway. Kevin smiled to himself smugly. Zoe was going to love the present he had gotten her. Walking towards the next shop, to buy the beer he had used as his excuse to leave. Looking up at him, Zoe stood up. "I need to feel this inside me," she said simply, as she looked straight into Will's eyes. "What about Kevin?" he asked, oddly enough sounding genuinely concerned. "My asshole of a fiancé bet that if you won." "Right?" Zoe replied. "Wait till I tell Kev I won the bet." Will said, "You're not going to tell him anything, remember?" Zoe replied. "What?" Will asked confusedly. "You didn't win the bet," Zoe answered simply. Will didn't even have to think before he nodded. She was actually going to cheat on Kevin, her fiancé. Kevin had bet her body to his best friend, so he deserved it, the bastard. He shouldn't make a bet he wasn't ready to cash out. As Zoe was about to lower herself some more, he looked to her concerned. "Kev said he'd be back in an hour or two. He's been out about 55 minutes. He could be back any minute," he said. Zoe smiled playfully down at him. "I guess you'd better me fast before he gets back then," she teased, and saw all concern leave Will's eyes and a smile grow on his face. Was just so unbelievable.